This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. So welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Tim Knotts, and I discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. It's Wednesday, February 14th, 2024. Happy Valentine's Day. I'm Lee Bortons, and we're also joined today with Kelly Wilt. She's a curriculum developer for Classical Conversations Multimedia. And once again, we have some great products to discuss with you. Jennifer, do you want to remind us about this month's themes and books that we're talking about?
Yeah, so we've been talking about some little extra resources that can help enrich your family's journey through different educational topics. And so we've talked about prescripts, cursive writing. Today we'll talk about classical acts and facts timeline cards. We're going to talk about classical acts and facts artist and composer cards. That's a mouthful. And classical music for dummies. So we're going to learn about looking, listening, writing well, and sharing some history stories.
That's great. So, I was looking at what you were talking about online to see all those books that we have. So everyone else can also look online. So you can go to ccbooks.com, which is always my ad. But it's classicalconversationsbooks.com to look at the material Jennifer just referenced. But you can also go to @Lee Bortons on YouTube and hear previous podcasts about each of the books that are on the leebortons.com archive under Words Aptly Spoken. Okay, so that was a mouthful. So three things: books at ccbooks.com, @Lee Bortons to see the YouTube video, and you can go to leebortons.com to see what's coming and purchase the books and the upcoming conversations that we're having. Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Help me unstumble.
I think we've all had a lot of conversations since very early this morning. I found myself tripping over my words too. And I realized after we talked about it being Valentine's Day, that's also Ash Wednesday. And that hasn't happened for a really long time that those are sharing a day. So we're opening the season of Lent today as well.
Yeah, season of love and Lent, both.
Yeah. Big day. So, well, let's start talking about the classical acts and facts timeline cards. So tell us, Lee, why you really wanted to have a timeline of history in the Foundation's memory work.
So, once again, a timeline is something students for, millennial have worked on. It's a way to simply recall facts and remember a story. And then once that's in your head, you can then embellish upon it. So I know that it's just a common thing for people to think, okay, so today I'm going to go to the grocery store and then I'm going to pick up the laundry and then I'm going to have to go to the soccer game. So we all do timelines all the time. It's natural, it's human. But one thing that got lost when grammar got knocked out of the modern curriculum was this idea that you could memorize lots of facts. And so we put together the classical acts and facts cards to give parents and students a tool in order to memorize key events in both Western history and culture, which we're Americans. That is the emphasis right now. But as CC's gone global, we have more and more global events added to our timeline cards. So that's basically why we are doing it, taking something we all do naturally and then practicing it in a way that stretches us even more. We know as parents, we know our child is really maturing when they hit 4, 5, 6 years old, and you can tell them 3 things to do rather than 1 thing to do, and 2 of them get done. So that's what we're trying to do, is just expand our ability to pay attention, think ahead, and process fragments of information in a way that they become a story.
Yeah, I like that idea of thinking about just sorting things in time. So we often sort things in space, but in the case of a timeline, we're talking about sorting things in time. And as I was prepping for us to talk today, I thought about 2 stories. One is when I worked for my college English professor on a work study program when I was in school. And one day I came into his office and he had taken all the books off the shelves and he said, I want you to put these back, not in order by author name, but in order chronologically.
Mm.
I just remember thinking, now keep in mind, there were no smartphones and no Google. So I did not have a ready reference at my fingertips to do this. And I later realized I think he did that more for my benefit than his. It was a lesson for me in thinking about a stream of thought that had gone through British literature. So fast forward to this weekend when I was organizing the 140 children's history books that I purchased. And I was singing my timeline song from Foundations and putting my books in order. And of course, there were gaps because there were some things we didn't talk about. I couldn't place in my mind, where did the Overland Mail or the Pony Express belong? And where was Custer's Last Stand and in reference to the Civil War? And so it was a really good reminder to me of that idea of sorting in space. So I did a lot of research this weekend and made my own timeline of books.
Jennifer, those things you just mentioned are things that our grandparents and great grandparents would have been familiar with. And I've started to think about how I'm getting old enough that some of the things that happened in my first decade or two are now like timeline history events for young kids today. They don't know anything about it, and we need to, keep going.
Yes, I saw a depressing meme on Facebook this week that said that some of the younger generation is now referring to the 1990s as the end of the 20th century. And I was like, no, that makes it sound further away than it was. Oh. Oh, well, Kelly, one of the tools we can use are these classical acts and facts timeline cards at home. So tell us what's on them. How can
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's very appropriate, Jennifer, that this recording actually falls on Valentine's Day, because the timeline cards, to me, are one of the most beloved products that we have in classical conversations for our families to use. So if you have the privilege of opening up a pack of CC's timeline cards, on the front of each card, you're going to see a beautiful work of art or a picture, which is very strategic because it's used as a memory peg for our students to be able to attach these individual timeline events to. And you'll also see the name of the timeline event as well as a year, so that as our students are looking at these cards, they could actually do like what you were just describing. They could put them in the order of events that they played out in history. And when you turn over the timeline card to the back side, you're going to see several paragraphs related to that particular event. You're going to see the names of people who were important, the names of events that led up to that particular event, and then hopefully also the consequences of that event as it played out or it's continuing to play out in history. And there are also some things you might not notice at first glance, but are equally as important. Along the left side of each timeline card, we have a timeline of history, and there is a little arrow to show you exactly where the timeline card falls. And at the very bottom, there's a map of the world with a dot or a region where that event took place. So they really are, thinking this week with the Super Bowl having just happened, to me, in my mind's eye, timeline cards are the MVP for a classical conversations family. And maybe they're valuable, but I'd say that V also stands for versatile. They can be used in so many different ways for such a long period of your family's homeschooling journey. So you can tell I really do love our timeline cards.
Wow, and that was a really good segue, Kelly, into our next topic, which is how we can all share on this question. Maybe Kelly, you'll start us off and then we'll all jump in. But how do we use these at home?
Oh, Jennifer, how long do we have to record? Well, when we first purchased our timeline cards, I actually have one of our little binders laying right here next to me with our cards. When my children were small, I would lay out the week's timeline events for the Foundation's memory work on the floor, and I had active little boys. So I would lay them in a row and they would hop beside them and we would recite the timeline events. So as a strategic young mom, I tried to get out some of that wiggly energy, but it also helped to cement those facts in their minds, just as we were reviewing Foundation's memory work. But later, as our family began a journey into essentials, we actually pulled some of the cards and we would use them for practice. We would identify quality adjectives or strong verbs that we saw in the cards. And I remember at one point, while my oldest was finishing his foundations years, they also, in relation to the foundations program, became a great source of information for weekly presentations in community. And so I would say, okay, rather than looking at the bottom of the floor of the van for whatever happened to be there that week.
No, that never happens.
Oh, I'm afraid I have to admit that probably did happen several times in those early busy years. I would tell him, what's your favorite timeline card that you can think of from the last few weeks? And he would go and he would flip through and he would find that thing that he was excited to talk about, whether it was, Caesar Augustus in the Pax Romana, or he seemed to always be connected to all the Roman Empire cards or war cards, those kinds of things. And in challenge, surprisingly, the timeline cards continued to be valuable to us as our children, continued to read American history, or they were reading about different literature from time periods. We could go back and we could attach that knowledge to what they had already submitted in foundations. So definitely, I can say for our family, they have been the MVP. They continue to sit on our shelves as our family finishes our homeschool journey with classical conversations, and they're still used on a weekly basis. Best investment ever.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that in challenge. I know a lot of challenge tutors who use the timeline, their memory of the timeline to answer circumstance questions. What else was going on in the world at the time of this novel? And you may not know a whole lot of what was going on in the world, but you've at least got 5 or 6 things that were in that week when you were in foundation. So you can pull that out and talk about it with the kids.
Right.
So how about you, Tim? How's your family use them?
Yeah, some of the same ways as Kelly's, but also some additional fun things. For our family, a lot of times the timeline cards hang up above the dining room table on the wall, and they're they become like a calendar. We've been through the cycles so many times now that you can look up and know where you are in the CC year by which cards are hanging up there over the table. But also the exercise of sorting in space and time can be done with these cards together. We take them down and spread them around and ask the kids to put them in order. Sometimes it's great to even have races to see who can get their set done quickest. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways there, and like Kelly pointed out, the art or images that are on the front make for some great conversation on their own. You can certainly supplement with what all is on the back, and there's a lot of good information there. But with little kids, you can sit down and just look at that picture and say, well, what do you see? How does this go with our history sentence that we've been learning in community this week, if it's close to that time period? It's really helpful for just opening some of those conversations.
I'd
Yeah.
like to add, it's been a long time since I had foundation students, but I just got finished this morning watching the National Memory Master videos and their submissions for our national competition, something that's a lot more thorough than at the local level, but the local level students in their own communities are preparing for it. And one of the things that the students who are really quite good at the timeline cards do, they started sharing with one another, is your eidetic memory. What you can see in your mind and hold easily is between 5 and 7 facts. So they've begun putting them everywhere in their house so that each group of 5 to 7 cards is on a different wall. And then they walk through their home and then they see all 160, is that how many cards there are? And then what that allows them to do is in the National Memory Master competition, they are often told the number of a card and told to go backwards 5 cards or forward 7 cards. And so what they're able to do is not see all 160 cards. They can see the cards that live by the window or the cards that live on the refrigerator. And because if you read one of the books that we carried, the 52 Brilliant, is it Memory Tricks? I can't remember the end of that title there.
Ways to develop a brilliant memory.
Yeah, 50. Okay.
Like
One of the tips is this whole idea of using geography for memory work, which is why no matter what kind of personality he has, you can ask a longtime golfer to describe his game, and he can tell you at every hole what he did, because each of them are different, and he's using that eidetic memory with experience to be able to tell a story. And so that's what the kids who are really good at memorizing have learned to do and shared with me. I didn't know about that when my kids were growing up. So
yeah, and that's a good graphic that we have. I think, is it on the rhetoric turf table? We have the little memory palace. graphic. And that's basically what the memory masters are doing. They're associating those items with a space. And so that's
I'm
walking
curious,
through.
Kelly, do you have on your screen so you could send it to us for the end of the podcast, the front and back of the card you were describing?
Of the timeline card that I was
Yeah,
describing.
just one of them.
Okay, let me see if I can locate that.
Yeah, as
I
we
can find
continue our
that.
conversation, so we can show
Sure.
them. You did such a great job of describing them, and I thought we should show one on the screen. So,
Sure.
That'd be great. Yes, like Kelly in our house, we often use them for presentations because we needed to graduate past the I grabbed a leaf in the church parking lot phase of presentations on a bad morning. So we would make keyword outlines too to practice IW. One of mine just really, as she got into that last year that she was in Essentials, kind of wanted an extra challenge. And so she wrote some of her papers by keyword outlining the history cards and doing that. So that's fun memories. All right. So Tim, you are our curriculum developer for the debate strand. So I want to know how these cards lay a foundation for their future studies of history.
Yeah. Really, a lot of things that have already been brought up are exactly what they do for us. Lee talked about how they help to stretch and build our memory, our ability to store and collect groups of facts. Part of being a very good debater is having at your disposal, sort of at your fingertips, things that you can bring up to use in your debate. Some of them prepared, right? So they may go home and make their own timeline card, in essence, as they prepare for a debate, things that they need to remember and have memorized. Or at other times, there's conversations or debates that come up sort of spontaneously, and having those things already ready for you in the back of your mind to pull up and use as the basis for your proofs is handy all by itself. But I think even more than that is the fact that these cards all together add up to build a spine of understanding. All right, they build sort of a golden chain through time and space that help students to put together what things mean because they have a context. Facts in isolation are never of very much value, but when you understand where they go in this great array of history, they have much more meaning. So I'll give you an example. When I was a new college graduate, I took the praxis exam, the teaching licensure exam for history. And I did pretty well on the parts that had to do with European history and American history. But as soon as they started to ask me to talk about the Mayan Empire and when the Mayans were flourishing and building their amazing things in the Yucatan Peninsula, I couldn't have told you. That might have been in the 1800s, or it could have been in the 400s. Maybe it was before Christ. I'm not sure. And I'm so glad that my children, should they ever go that route, won't have that problem. They'll understand that even though the Mayans lived in a different part of the world, they were advancing their technologies and their civilization right around the same time as some of the great European civilizations were building themselves. And so that kind of collective knowledge is so helpful for not just throwing out facts to sort of proof text your way through life, but instead to understand the meaning of these things that you're encountering and being able to evaluate both your own and your opponent's arguments well.
Yeah, that's really good. We're getting ready to show the history card, but I was also thinking my uncle is an amateur archaeologist, and he went on a 3-week dig in Crete and brought home a really long slideshow. And my kids were pretty small. And so we're sitting there at Christmas, and there's a lot of photos of this archaeological dig to get through. And he flashed up a piece of pottery, and one of them goes, "Oh, Minoans and Mycenaeans," and his jaw just dropped. And I was thinking, yeah, that's right. They know about bull jumpers because they can see that Minoan card in their head. So that's a a fun connection that they were able to make where they wouldn't have been able to enter into what he was saying other than their timeline. So that's always been fun for us. All right. So Emma, do you have did we find an image that we can show them what Kelly was describing? All right. Here we go. Oh,
So why don't you point out just quickly some of those main features you did earlier, Kelly?
Sure, absolutely. So what you see here is the back is our timeline card binder lying on our kitchen table right now as we speak. The card that you see on the left is card 41. So if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that number, which, you know, as busy families, sometimes the timeline cards might all end up in a pile accidentally or not so accidentally. And so it's helpful for quick reorganization as well. But let's look on the right. There's a beautiful image of John the Baptist, and any foundation student would recognize this image because they see it, and they also know that the timeline event that follows this is Jesus the Messiah, and they all delight in singing that in cadence with the timeline song. But you see a beautiful image here, and also the name John the Baptist, and then the time period. And one thing I forgot to mention, but also is a helpful organizational tool, is if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a yellow tab, and there's an image there, a silhouette image, and Age of Ancient Empires. The lettering is kind of small, but it gives you a historical subgroup by which these events fit into. So as students are memorizing, they're memorizing a timeline, but likely mentioned before, you know, with our National Memory Master students who acquire these wonderful tools. This also is a visual tool for grouping too, that may be subconscious to a lot of our students, but it's there as a visual reminder of when this event took place. So on the card on the left, this is the timeline event Caesar Augustus and the Pax Romana, which was the subject of several foundations presentations in our home. But you can see here we have our title across the very top and then a range of events. So on the front of the card, there is a singular time because that's helpful for thinking about the beginning of things like eras or ages. But on the back, you'll see the accurate era for when an event took place, if it was more than a day or a year. And then you'll see below several paragraphs. And even just looking at the first paragraph, you can see people who were crucial to this timeline event in history. And then as you're reading through the card, you will see down at the very bottom of those paragraphs, what were the consequences of this event? What were the consequences of the reign of Caesar Augustus and then the unfolding of the Pax Romana on history? And the other two visual tools that I mentioned, which are so incredibly helpful, along the left, you see this beautiful color spectrum timeline. And then there's a little arrow here to let you know more precisely when this event took place. And then at the very bottom of the card, there is a map. And if you look very closely, you can see the little red dots here. There's a red dot over Rome, which is where this event primarily took place. So it's a great set of tools within a tool to help your student be able to unfold these events of history, almost like threads running in a tapestry, seeing how they weave together and then weave apart to be able to give the history of, you know, God's history that he's unfolded for us in the world. So just an incredibly helpful, beautiful tool for any CC family, not just Foundations family, to be able to use in their home.
I like how you have them in a single binder. It reminded me of when I was a little girl and I would just like pour through the World Book Encyclopedia. I didn't care which volume I was in, and I just would love reading it. Well, most people don't have encyclopedias on their desks and on their shelves anymore. So this is like a very brief encyclopedia of world history, and having it bound like this would make it so that it's easy to flip through and have your children just look at it sometimes just because it's interesting.
Absolutely. Well, and having the cards and the little page protectors is also helpful if we do want to remove them for some reason. For example, if I look at my children and I say, you know what, I want you to find every card in the timeline set that you feel tells the story of, and then think of a particular geographic, area of the world. They can go through and they can find, the entire history in relation to Australia or to China, and then assemble that story of history across the floor car and read the history, and then they can put it back into our binder. So it's been really helpful to organize it this way.
Thank
Also
you for
keeps
that.
jammy and chocolatey fingers off of the cards.
That is an additional plus.
Absolutely.
Maybe
Or in my case,
something that might help people to know is these cards have a very light kind of lamination on them. It's just to make it so that they're slick and stay nice. They're a heavy cardboard, and then the print is a really good quality. So that's another reason to keep the jammy fingers off. They are, pretty nice.
yeah. All right, well, we're about ready to have the portion of our time where we're actually going to read one of the history cards, and then Kelly is going to lead us through a discussion. But Lee, do you need to take our break and add, or?
I'll be happy to
Sure.
promote
Okay.
classicalconversationsbooks.com one more time, especially since I kind of botched it at the introduction. But classicalconversationsbooks.com is where the books discussed and words aptly spoken can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 and 2024 Words Aptly Spoken calendar and archive at leebortons.com with links to purchase the books that we are discussing. We encourage you to have your own book club around these books and maybe use these videos as a launch point for you. And you also can go on to Aptly Bortons, my YouTube channel, and watch the videos there. So thank you. Next week, we're going to be talking about more of these timeline cards, the classical acts and facts, artists and composers.
All right. Well, I have the Sound of Music song. Let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start going through my head. So we're actually going to read the very first history card because that seems like a very good place to start. So Tim is going to read it to us one paragraph at a time, and then Kelly will lead us through a discussion of what we just read.
Great. All right, here we go. The first known cities, which would grow into the ancient empires, appeared around 3000 BC. Towns were constructed near rivers and depended on these reliable sources of water for drinking, cooking, bathing, irrigating crops, and transportation. In these agricultural societies, farmers designed tools for clearing land and harvesting crops, constructed irrigation systems for their fields, and developed breeding techniques for their animals.
You're muted, Kelly.
There we go. As Tim read this, I wanted to ask everyone to close their eyes and picture what he was reading. So, when we think about using the 5 core habits, we're thinking of the habits of naming and attending and memorizing and expressing and storytelling. So the questions that I'm going to ask you are in relation to those habits. So let's use our imaginations. What do you think the towns looked like? And what do you think it smelled like near that river?
I have particular memories of playing by Oklahoma creeks and lakes, and it smells like the soil. Once you get the dirt wet, you get that strong smell. So that's what I'm imagining. I don't quite know what their soil smells like, but I'm imagining that earthy smell of wet earth.
I think that's a good observation. Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I noticed in here that irrigation came up a couple of times, and thinking about the sort of the ditches and the fields that surround these small villages. So they're very intimately connected with their food and their animals and the fields that are right there next door to their houses.
Well, and Lee, let's think about another sense. If you were there with all these activities going on by the river, what sounds do you think you would hear?
Well, by the river, hopefully you would hear the river running. Otherwise,
Right.
it was going to smell really bad.
Yes.
Right. And then, I suspect a lot of kind of beating sounds going on. Laundry being beaten, maybe animals' hoofs clopping, some digging, some hoeing, maybe gathering some of the various roots and reeds that are along the riverbank, but just a lot of rhythmic noises. What I can imagine happening. But we were all also talking about towns that become cities and then empires. And I think a lot of people forget that in 3000 BC, there were some pretty big cities in this world.
There were. And so there would be a lot of, I guess, what we classify as busyness, busy noise, activity. And that doesn't always mesh with the way that we may have pictured history in the past, that there was this industry, hand industry there. Okay, so if we're thinking about this first paragraph, do you think that we could use these details to tell a story about a family who might have lived in one of these ancient villages? If we were going to tell a story about them, what different elements do you think that we would be able to bring into our story based on what Tim just read to us?
Building a dam to control the waterfall of the water wheel that's on the banks. And how Dad had to do that, and maybe somebody's broke their leg doing it, or
right, the dangers of having industry so near a source of water like that, for sure, for sure.
I was picturing as Tim was reading that I think my daughters would have wanted to make up a family. They would have wanted to name the dad and the mom and make up some kids and name them and possibly name some of their, their animals. My son, on the other hand, I think would have, this is not your storytelling question, but I was Tim was reading, he would have wanted to play in the mud that day and design tools for digging. And he would have wanted to construct buildings for his city and make a dam and let me turn the hose on for him so that he could watch how his irrigation system and dam worked. So that was not quite an answer to your question, but that's probably what he would have done.
No, but I love that because that is expressing, right? That's taking what he's imagining and bringing it to life. I love that. I love that. Tim, what about you?
Yeah, for some of my kids, as they've embarked on sort of the IEW program and been given some tools to shape some stories, that's been really helpful. But earlier on, their stories go all over the place. And I think that in this card right in front of you, you have a few lists of things that could be a really good outline for a story. If you can give a kid and say, look, there's water for drinking, cooking, bathing, and irrigating crops and transportation. There's a nice little story for you. Tell about those things. Or designing tools for clearing land, right? And constructing irrigation systems. There are things that are good, strong activities that are already listed here for a student to pick right up on.
I love that. I love that. You guys are doing a great job. Tim, do you want to read to us the second paragraph?
Yeah, sure. The early empires to develop in this period included Sumer, present-day Iraq, the Indus River Valley, present-day Pakistan, Crete, Egypt, the Kazma Valley, present-day Peru, and the Shang Dynasty, present-day China. Many people mistakenly think that the Age of Ancient Empires was a primitive time in the history of mankind. In actuality, the ancient civilizations that flourished during this period developed useful tools, elaborate architecture, civil and military governments, and systems of writing that allowed them to keep records. Some of the wonders of these ancient empires include the ziggurat temples and cuneiform writing of ancient Sumer, the pyramids and hieroglyphs of Egypt, the large stone temples of Peru, the carefully planned citadels of the Indus Valley, and the intricate silk, bronze, and jade artifacts designed in the first Chinese cities.
Tim, as you were reading that, I immediately thought, like Jennifer, what my boys would have thought reading this. And I think they would have delighted in what people think that is not so. So looking at this paragraph, what ancient civilizations do we see named in the second paragraph on the back of this card? Just ancient.
So the Indus River Valley, Crete,
Yes.
Egypt, Kazma Valley,
Yes.
Shang Dynasty. So there's 5 of them.
Absolutely. And then there are modern ones also named. What modern civilizations do we see?
Besides Egypt, Peru. Is that what you're thinking?
Iraq and Pakistan and China.
Absolutely. So
Some of
why
them
do you,
kept their names. So
right. Why do you think it's important for this card with the Age of Ancient Empires to also list the modern locations? Why is that important?
Some of our kids are going to go look for these places on their maps because they'll get excited about it and want to know where are these places, and they're not going to find them on a modern globe or a modern map.
That's right. That's right. It's good for them to be able to translate what they see then into what we know now. Absolutely. So Jennifer, I'm going to throw this question to you first. Looking at this paragraph and listening to these details, what do you think you could draw from hearing this paragraph from the card?
So when my kids were little, we actually did this. We learned what the cuneiform alphabet looked like, and they learned. It was one of my rare moments of craftiness in my house. I made salt dough, and they each put their name in the salt dough in cuneiform, and then they colored it to make sure it was super visible. They colored it with a Sharpie, and we still have those tablets upstairs.
I love that. I love that. All right, Lee, I know your background is in engineering. Listening to this paragraph, what could you build?
Well, obviously, if this could tie into the bridge building contest we have in the foundations program, as well
Yes.
as sugar cube pyramids made at home, Legos, Duplos, all those kinds of things. Human pyramids is a recess activity with the entire community. Just, anything that you want to build is a good idea to do with children. And then, I was thinking about the from Jennifer Courtney's book, The Echoes.
Hmm.
I think it was the Ancient Ones, where it was the first Cinderella story. As you
Yes.
were reading this, that story came back to me because she was in
Oh.
Egypt by a pyramid. And I
Mhm.
was thinking, this gives me some more words to help me see the relevance of the story we read a few weeks ago, which might be the case in your own homeschool because you have, CC materials.
That's so good. I didn't even think about Rhodopis until you said that. And now I'm like, oh, of course. So I think, Lee, you highlighted one of the things that's so beautiful about the cards. Our children are constantly attaching information
Mhm.
to these timeline events and to what they read on the back of the card. So that's another benefit of using these. Okay, Tim, go ahead. I was going to say you're about to burst.
Oh yeah, there's just some awesome words in there too that some kids are gonna hear and want to know more about, or are gonna think they're funny, like ziggurat, or right, or
Yes.
hieroglyphs.
Yes.
They're just gonna be some of them are gonna giggle or be confused, and there's a great opportunity to learn some new vocabulary. Go look them up and see what a stepped pyramid looks like.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The other
Well,
thing, in contrast to the paragraph we just read, this paragraph really does make you think of cities versus the other
yes.
one made you think more of towns, which
Mm,
may or may not be actually accurate because we got to remember that these are brief paragraphs on the back of a card, and they can
right.
allude to many locations or ideas in that geographical and as well as historical time. And
Right.
so if you actually have a book about the Indus River Valley and it doesn't seem to be about an ancient empire, who cares? Write a paragraph about, from the book that you have if you need to.
Right. Right.
I think I'm sharing all these stories where I really got stretched by my children. Abby fascinated by Abby always wanted to do something elaborate for her presentations.
Mm,
She's majoring in art and graphic design, and I don't know where that came from. It was from me. And so when we got to the seven wonders of the ancient world, and we learned that many people think the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was a ziggurat type structure, she
mm.
decided it would be a fantastic idea for us to build one out of the following materials: Rice Krispie treats, chocolate frosting, and plastic plants. So I was like, I will buy all the things. I'm having trouble visualizing what you're seeing. And so I bought all the things and turned her loose in the kitchen, and she built a ziggurat out of Rice Krispie treats. So
Okay, so Jennifer, you're bringing back memories to me. I can distinctly remember one of the times that our foundations community began cycle one, which is our focus on empires. We had a big kickoff, orientation as a community. And so I was tasked with bringing a dessert, and my daughter, in similar fashion, decided she wanted me to construct a Rice Krispie Great Pyramid. And not only that, she wanted to have it be accurate in that the center of it was hollowed out, and we had little Playmobil Egyptians. And so we very thoroughly sanitized a little sarcophagus with the mummy inside. And inside the stack of Rice Krispie treats was the little sarcophagus. And she was just waiting with delight for someone to discover that under the pile of Rice Krispies, there was, Ramses. hiding there. So, thinking about these kinds of things, it just brings history alive, doesn't it? I mean, in a way that is tangible and also so fun and full of joy and discovery
Yeah.
for our students. All right, Tim, we have one more paragraph. Will you read that for us?
Sure. The age of ancient empires included startling times of upheaval as rival warriors within city-states fought for control and neighboring tribes invaded. There were also times of peace and stability maintained by codified laws, such as Hammurabi's Code. The Minoans, Mycenaeans, Hittites, Babylonians, Assyrians, Hebrews, Phoenicians, and Persians followed the early river valley civilizations in this era. The age of ancient empires peaked with the sophisticated civilizations of Greece and Rome.
Oh, so you can see, just like I alluded to earlier, you can see the thread of consequences that continues to weave from this timeline event into the ones that follow. So, looking at this paragraph, do we see what code of laws do we hear mentioned in this final paragraph?
Code of Hammurabi.
Yes. And so thinking about, that idea that I mentioned earlier about taking the timeline cards and stringing them together, around a particular topic, you could look at your student and say, I want you to pull every card that you see that relates to laws and government. Well, initially, you might not think of the Age of Ancient Empire card as being something connected to that, but here you go. This is the beginning of that, with our timeline card set. I love that. Anyone else? Any other codes of law?
Well, just the preference city-state implies that there's
Mm,
some sort of law going on.
mhm, mhm. So
And,
looking at oh, go ahead, Tim. I'm sorry.
and of course, mentioning the Hebrews for most of our families will
Yes,
immediately bring to mind the Mosaic Code, right? The law of Moses.
Mhm.
that is so true. That is so true. So what other kinds of authorities, and Lee's kind of already alluded to this a little bit, what other kinds of authorities did these ancient civilizations answer to?
Mhm.
Tribes,
Usually,
cities, and
Mm-hmm,
states.
mm-hmm.
And
sometimes
these are
really
even,
strong dictators.
yeah,
Yes, yes.
and
Sorry,
these are even empires, so they may have been expansive geographically, which is why you had city states, because there was, people always think of kings like the King of England or the King of Persia, but back in this
Right,
era, anybody who had any kind of serfs was the king of his
right.
serfs, and that's how the little cities were made, and they protected one another, and then they would group as states against a bunch of city states that were down the road.
Mhm.
So,
to be reminded of that yesterday, oddly enough, in challenge 4, because we were translating lines from the Aeneid, and the students have already read the Iliad in English, and then in the Aeneid, all these tribes of Greeks were mentioned, all these different names, the Argives, the Danaans. Anyway, they had to remember that those really were kings of city states. They were in a loose alliance with each other, but they did not answer to one another. And
Right.
it was good for us to remember as we looked at the fallout from the Trojan War.
that's
Mm,
good.
I
I
love
also
that.
I also really like this because it shows that there is this sort of trajectory that
Mm,
that there were these city states and warring tribes that did move more and more toward these consolidated power structures that arrived finally with Greece and Rome,
Mhm.
that it wasn't just the same everywhere all the time.
that's right. That's
And
right.
then you mentioned Hebrew, Tim. I mean, all of these tribes are mentioned in the Bible, so it's one more relation there. One thing I want to point out to our listeners, though, is we're a pretty smart bunch here. With the four of us have been homeschooling a lot of kids a long time. I mean, me putting it all together is 80 years of experience,
Mm,
and so we kind of can naturally make all these connections. And we don't feel like parents who are new to the program or new to classical education need to be able to do what we've just done in order to use these cards well. If your students are old enough that they're in the essentials program and they're learning how to write paragraphs, you don't have to know the deep meaning of all this in order to make it a paragraph that they summarize or pull out keywords. The material, I mean, this paragraph in particular is hard because there's big names in it, but the first one wasn't. And so there's a way for everybody, adult or child, at any level of ability to start thinking classically and integrated, because the timeline cards themselves, in many ways, are fragmented at first. It takes a while to pull that chain together. That Kelly, you pulled out really well on the back side of these cards.
Yeah, I
Well,
was thinking that too, Lee, that if you were in your second year in foundations, you might simply look at the sentence that lists all the civilizations and recite the parts of the timeline that go with each of those. So you could use it as a preview for the rest of the year once you've memorized it once. Um,
Mhm.
so
Absolutely. Well, I just think you have to take an attitude of discovery as a
Mhm.
parent, that you're in a season of discovery as much as your child is, and delight in it and enjoy it. You can tell from our conversation that these are not just memory tools, they are conversation starters. So some night at supper, when you're sitting with your family, go through your timeline cards, pull out a timeline card, read it together, and just have a conversation about what you observe. You don't have to have a storehouse of information built up. Discover it together. There's joy in that. That's what it means to be a homeschooler, right? That you are enjoying that process together. And that now that we're ending that journey, at least with our three children, hopefully with our grandchildren to come, there'll be another season of that. But I long for those days where we would have everyone around the table as our children have grown and they're moving into their own, creating their own families someday. So definitely, looking at these, Jennifer, thank you for letting me lead that conversation.
Yeah.
It just is amazing how something that you look at as a tool can also be such an engine for discovery for a family.
That's great phrase, engine of discovery. Yeah.
Mm.
I'm going to use that more often.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that was a good way to end. Go ahead,
Well,
Lee.
thank you all of you. You're a great team, and I really appreciate those who listen to the podcast and consider purchasing the Acts and Facts cards and joining classical conversations. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks.